First question I would have for our panelists, and any of you can speak to this, but I'll lead off with John, is, so as Congress is contemplating tougher action on Iran, you know, a number of draft legislation is being considered, you know, there's a suggestion by some that we should hold off any action until after the Iranian elections. And the reasoning behind that is that new legislation might favor the hardliners over the moderates, and let's not, you know, let's wait till that sorts itself out before putting our hand on the scale. So my question to each of you is, you know, what are your reactions to that concern or that opinion as it's expressed by many?
Well, I don't think there's any point in waiting to take steps that we think are important to protect Americans and our friends in the region. That's an argument that gives the discretion about when and to what extent to cause us harm to people who don't have our best interests at heart. And I would have to say as well that the argument about what effect we're going to have on the elections in Iran pales under the significance of what the Ayatollah Khamenei and his people are going to do in the elections in Iran. These are not real elections. They're so manipulated. The candidacies are manipulated. The outcomes are manipulated. And fundamentally, they're more, the extent they have any real impact, it's on domestic policy, not on foreign policy where we're most concerned. I never saw anything in the entire time I was in the government looking at all these discussions between moderates and hardliners to show there was the slightest bit of difference on the nuclear weapons program. So I don't really care whether they follow strict Islamic law on domestic issues or somewhat less strict Islamic law. They're all in favor of nuclear weapons that can be used against us and our allies. And I just think it's a mistake for the United States to preemptively limit our options on the theory that we're having an influence, in this case in an internal election, where that influence is really very remote.
So as usual, I concur with Ambassador Bolton. I would only point out that anybody who thinks that what we do is going to be a major factor in the Iranian elections fundamentally misunderstands the nature of Iran's political system. Iran's political system is not free and it's not fair, and it reflects much more a broad spectrum of consensus of conservative Khomeiniist thought than it does any true representation of liberals and conservatives from across the political spectrum. In that context, I remember in a room very similar to this debating a few years ago whether or not Hassan Rouhani was actually a moderate. And I had the temerity to point out that he may be a moderate now in the American political parlance, but he was nothing if not a government functionary and one of the original revolutionaries who stepped off the plane with Khomeini in Tehran in February of 1979. In much the same way, I think the U.S. media is in danger of being misled about the range of political opinion that's present within the Iranian system as we move into election season in Tehran. Rouhani may be embattled, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's our guy. And I think that's a useful thing to point out because our reflexive instinct is always to say, well, the other guy is worse, and so we're going to support Rouhani. But in this particular case, whoever ends up being president is more or less in line with the views of the supreme leader, and he's certainly in line with the overall radical direction of the Islamic Republic itself.
I just want to add a couple points to fully agree with Ambassador Bolton and Ilan about the elections, and let's get to the bottom line. Why do we have to wait until the outcome of the elections? Let's assume the elections, which is now really boiled down to Hassan Rouhani and Ebrahim Raisi, the well-known cleric who now heads the Astana Quds Razavi, one of those foundations I talked about earlier. He just announced his candidacy today, just a couple hours ago. At the end of the day, let's assume that Rouhani wins back the second term. So what? I mean, look at the track record of Rouhani in the past 4 years, both in terms of the nuclear program. By the way, the nuclear negotiations did not start under Rouhani. It started under Ahmadinejad. It had the full approval, and it was engineered by the Supreme Leader, Khamenei. Look at his track record in terms of all of the things they've been doing in the past 4 years in Syria, in Bahrain, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, all of that, and also domestically. There have been more executions under Rouhani, 3,000, than it was under Ahmadinejad for the same period. And really, this whole, game of every 4 years, people talking about who would win the elections as president. President really has no real role in running the country. The actual president, the way we define it here in Western countries, is actually the Supreme Leader, Khamenei. He has all the authority, all the power. Even the power that is associated with the president in the Constitution, Khamenei has the authority to veto it and dismiss it. So what difference would it make is practically zero. Remember back in 1997 when the so-called bigger moderate, that was Mohammad Khatami, became president, what happened? Iran made more advancements on its nuclear program under Khatami than anybody else. When Khatami became president, Natanz, Arak, a whole host of those nuclear sites didn't even exist. And it was all really made and moved, advanced forward under him. The Shahab missile was all tested and advanced under Khatami. So we've seen all of that. We've seen the so-called moderates or the radicals. The outcome has been the same over the past 37 years. And I think the presentation today and the different conversations and the talks that all the speakers had clearly pointed out to the fact that we're talking about a clerical system. It makes no difference whatsoever who becomes the president. So you shouldn't wait for a single day, let alone the elections in Iran.